I just got a little bit of groceries. They're in the back seat.
Okay.
I came out, I saw that bag in the back. I thought it was just somebody putting trash in my truck, which has happened before.
Yeah.
So I opened that outside bag, and I saw there was another bag inside of it with what looked like some clothes and some blood on it.
You just were putting some groceries in there and saw the bag?
Yeah, I saw the bag. I said, oh, somebody's thrown trash back here or something. So I opened the first one to see if it was garbage, and some red, and it looked like some socks or something.
But you didn't see what else was in there?
No.
All right. Well, obviously there's something bad in there.
I was dispatched to a call of a suspicious item in a pickup truck at a local supermarket with what looked to be blood coming out of it. As a first responding officer, we never know what we're gonna get. It's always a mystery. At the scene, I did activate my body camera.
You didn't open it, you just touched it?
The outside bag I opened.
Okay. And then what did you see when you opened it?
I saw there was 3 dots and that blood on, or what looked like blood on the second bag.
And then you closed it right back up?
And that's what walked away. I didn't touch anything after that.
It was a rainy, cold day, and the last thing that anyone wanted to do was to be looking into a bag in the back of a pickup truck. And my initial thoughts were it was probably a dead animal because here in Arkansas, there's a lot of hunting, and didn't expect something horrible.
If it's an animal, I mean, it looks like an animal. It could be an animal.
That is blood.
Yeah, that's blood.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I started calling for extra authorities to come and help.
Upon my arrival, as I got in my vehicle, I walked around towards the truck. There were black bags. Did notice the red liquid in the bed of the truck. Hey, let's just leave everything like it is. Let's string tape up around our cars.
Sandy, you got tape?
I'll go out. It was originally a bag in a bag in a bag foil.
Wasn't it?
I walked back over to the back of his truck where some other officers were, and it was pretty tense at that time. Which bag is it in?
It's in this one, in foil.
I opened the bag. That's when I saw a partial face. I was horrified at the moment and really didn't know what to think.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to photograph it as it is, and then we're going to tell it to the police.
Okay, good. We didn't know if it was a real human head. It was a couple of days out from Halloween, and I want to make sure that this wasn't some sort of prank. First, I was like, okay, it's getting close to Halloween. Are we sure that this is some sort of whatever?
Being so close to Halloween, there was definitely some apprehension about it being a prank. We thought it could be decorations of some kind or some kind of Halloween prop.
All this was in that bag?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That's a human head.
Yeah, it's real.
We opened the bag and we peeled back the aluminum foil and saw that it was an actual woman's head. This wasn't any crime. She was murdered. Hey, we apparently have a human head in the back of this truck in a trash bag. This isn't like some sort of prank. This is a real head. Obviously, there's a pause there because you realize that you're hoping that it was a prank. Then you have a million other things that start running through your mind at that time.
The level that somebody would go to remove somebody's head from their body. It did seem personal.
When I opened the bag and I saw the human face, I was so horrified, and I would say I was probably in shock, because during my years here at the Hot Springs Police Department, this is something that they don't tell you will happen. This is something you don't expect to happen. This is something you don't train for.
As detectives, we try to not personalize the cases that we respond to. But at the end of the day, this was, in fact, somebody's mom, grandma.
It was just unimaginable to think that someone could cut someone's head off and put it in a trash bag. That was just unthinkable to me.
My first thought was, where's the rest of her? Where did this occur? And were there other victims? Those things obviously start running through your mind. We need to figure out who she was. This was a mystery.
Try to get these looky-loos back as best we can.
Next, we turned our focus to a gentleman named Adam, whose truck it was and who had made the phone call that summoned us to the scene.
This your truck?
It's my truck.
Wait, how long ago did you pull up here?
I don't know, within an hour.
We want to gain information, and the best way to do that is to keep him calm. Whether the story he was telling me was true or not, we were going to find out.
Let's get you out of the rain. Just have you see my car real quick. You're not in trouble. You're not under arrest. We're fixing to block all this off, okay?
Now, I didn't check the back of my truck before I left my house.
Yeah.
So
Where do you live at?
Maybe 5 minutes from here.
Okay.
Yeah,
You didn't
I
notice
don't-
anything in the back then?
No, I didn't. But I also didn't go back there and look.
Yeah. Okay. And did you see anything else?
You always have to have a level of skepticism with anything anybody tells you until you find out the facts.
He's going to call his wife and have them come to the PD.
I opened the bag and there was another bag inside of it, and that's when I saw what looked like blood and some like clothes, and so I just walked away. I put my hands up and walked over to the red box and called the police.
Normally, in a situation like that, people react in all kinds of ways. Sometimes they are very, overdramatic and can kind of flail around and scream and cry. Other times they remain silent, kind of like Adam did. At that time, we did not know if Adam was involved or the extent of his involvement in this case.
Adam kept saying he didn't know the victim. With no way to confirm who she was, we had to start somewhere.
I'm going to call the county real quick, see if they got any missing. Hey, do you guys have any missing persons, females, maybe in their 60s?
I contacted our local sheriff's department to see if they had any missing persons of somebody about the same age.
Oh, okay. Well, we've got a head in a bag out here.
We had no female missing persons in her age group at that time.
So earlier in that day, officers did take a missing persons report for a man named Aaron Goodwin. None of this seemed to be linked together. So either we were missing something or we weren't able to connect all the pieces to yet.
The next step would have been putting out a nationwide BOLO for any missing persons that might fit her age group.
This is Detective Hunter Scott, okay?
How are you?
Your car, we're going to do some photographs. We're going to tow it to the police department. But yeah, your car, unfortunately, it's a crime scene right now.
The next, we turned our focus to the back of the pickup truck where the head was found.
Adam's truck was fairly clean. There was no other evidence that was collected from his truck. So it led us to believe that the truck was merely a means to transport the head to another location.
While at the scene, officers had got with the big box store security to ascertain whether or not another person is observed on video putting the black bags into the back of Adam's truck. The security footage gives you a lot of information. Obviously, if somebody had dropped those bags in the truck in the parking lot, we would have had somebody to start looking for a suspect. The video surveillance revealed that Adam pulls up in his vehicle. He walks inside. He pays for his groceries and walks outside as he's putting his bags in the back of the truck. And then he is observed going around and investigating the bags under the back of his truck.
It was evident that no one came up to his truck at any point. No one even walked even remotely close to his vehicle. That told us that this had happened somewhere else.
Adam's truck was still part of the mystery that we had to figure out. But in any homicide investigation, the first thing you want to do is identify the victim. If Adam had known this particular person, or there was some sort of elaborate conspiracy to frame Adam. You got to start at the very beginning with her identification and how that leads back to Adam or anybody else.
So we were still left with more questions than answers.
And when you're dealing with dismemberment of an individual, there's always the possibility of other victims.
We didn't know if we had a serial killer, if this was an isolated incident, if there were going to be more bodies, or what this was going to look like. Nothing about this crime made sense.
They'll probably need you to come down to the station.
Okay.
To get a statement about kind of what's going on.
Okay.
But yeah, your car, unfortunately, it's a crime scene right now.
All right.
Well, like I said, it ain't good.
Adam, who discovered the head in his truck, he was a little nervous. As we spoke more to Adam, I started to realize that he could have been an intricate part of this. We didn't want to tell him exactly what we had found, because at this point he was still a person of interest in this case.
Obviously, he's the first person you want to talk to. And the best place to do that would be the police department.
We walked Adam into the interrogation room, and nothing was off the table until we spoke to him. Just like everyone else, we treated him the exact same. There were no assumptions and no exceptions.
Just gonna patch you down. I'm just gonna we have to make sure you don't have any weapons or anything on you.
I got keys and stuff.
Yeah, you're good. I'll just I just wanna make sure you don't have any like guns or bazookas or anything. Stand up against this wall for me real quick.
Yep. Over this way?
Yeah, just like that. Put your hands against the wall. And spread your feet for me.
Okay.
Just like that. Good.
Adam's demeanor was very calm, so our language back to him was a mirror of that. I didn't want to agitate him, just in case he was willing to provide more information that we were looking for.
Hey, sir, how you doing?
Hey, Adam.
I know this is a strange situation, okay? So what we kind of want to do is find out what happened. Yes, there's a crime scene in the back of your truck, okay? And so we're trying to just piece together what's going on. Okay, I want you to understand that. We just want you to help us so that we can try to piece together what happened.
We needed Adam to give us a rundown of his entire morning routine. What happened that day, what happened that morning. Walking us through his timeline from home to the grocery store to finding the bag, and then what led us to where we are right now.
Where all have you been today?
Today?
Yes, sir.
Just to Walmart.
Okay, so you left from your house and went to Walmart, and then tell me what happened when you got to Walmart.
I got there around noon or so. Had a short grocery list. Just a couple of things: milk, flour, eggs. Wife's doing some baking. Came back out to the truck. I noticed something in the back and looked a little weird, so opened it up. I saw what looked like blood, and I backed away and called 911.
Okay.
During the interview with Adam, we were trying to figure out if there were any kind of cracks to his story and trying to fill in those missing pieces. Adam's story from the scene back to the interview room, they were almost identical. His timeline of events didn't change at all.
Let me ask you this. Have you had problems with anybody that anybody would be trying to pull a Halloween prank on you or anything like that? Problems with any neighbors?
No, and I get along with all my neighbors pretty well. I mean, it's a quiet neighborhood.
And Adam really didn't have any problems with anybody. Nothing out of the ordinary as far as things in his neighborhood that would lead us to believe that this could have happened there. In a case like this, there wasn't much to go on, but even the smallest detail could be what we needed to solve this case.
Have you had any weird things in the neighborhood happen
I had somebody steal the motor off the back of my boat about maybe 2 months ago, and I filed a report about that.
Okay.
But there had been some recent thefts. It kind of piqued our interest.
Have you noticed anything unusual? Anybody strange in the neighborhood, vehicles, anything like that?
I have seen a guy walking down the street, older gentleman with a backpack a couple of times, and I don't know where he's going to, but
Okay.
I see him walking up and down our street, so I don't know if he just walks everywhere or what, but I don't know him.
When Adam said that he had saw the man with the backpack that seemed odd to him, that's obviously something that we wanted to look into as well to see if he played any role in this case.
Would there be anywhere on your street that maybe somebody has a homeless camp? Like, is there any woods or anything right around their house or anything like that?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
The man with the backpack obviously could have been a convenient detail that Adam is trying to throw us off to maybe throw blame upon somebody that we didn't know who it was yet.
But also, we thought that maybe this mystery man was involved.
When we have a serious incident like that, especially something so heinous, it's also possible that the person that's responsible was in the area watching us respond to the scene. It's kind of gives them a high to see us responding to the thing that they caused. So we went back and reviewed body camera footage from the crime scene, just to see if anybody looked out of place. Like the man with the backpack that Adam said that he had seen. After reviewing body camera footage, we didn't locate the person that Adam had said that he had seen walking with a backpack. And Adam could have just been giving us false information to where we were just kind of running in circles. The way things were going during this investigation, we weren't ready to take anything at face value.
One of the things that came out in the investigation was Adam stated that he had been at the Doubletree Hotel and at a work conference the night before, which obviously piqued curiosity.
It was important to kind of figure out why he was at the Doubletree, and if that could lead us to any indication of what happened in finding this bag.
Detectives responded to the hotel to see if they could retrieve video of the parking lot and Adam's truck. Getting the video would take time. We did go to Adam's house and verify that the crime scene did not occur there. No evidence was found, which was pretty frustrating.
Adam is still a person of interest. But we did end up releasing him.
Then during the initial part of this investigation, we got a call that changed everything. Officers in Vernon County, Missouri, had responded to a welfare check and discovered a middle-aged woman deceased in the home, headless in a bathtub. It was a homeowner, Connie Goodwin.
If these two cases were connected, then we were dealing with something far more disturbing than what we originally realized.
I received a call from the Vernon County Sheriff's Department requesting assistance investigating a homicide. They located the body of a female victim in the bathroom of the residence, and she was missing her head. The female was identified as Connie Goodwin.
Vernon County sent her identification pictures to our agency here, and our local coroner's office was able to confirm that the head that we had here was indeed Connie Goodwin. Identifying her remains was a huge development in our case, but we had no idea how her head had ended up in Hot Springs, over 300 miles away. We had a crime, and now we needed to know who was responsible.
In our family, Mama's the calm in the storm. She always held everybody together. She was always the one to reach out, want to plan family gatherings. As people would start to drift, she's always important to her to draw people back together. family was very important to her.
In the beginning, the only thing I could think of was that, oh, they're going to go check on her and she's just going to be passed out and they're going to take her to the hospital and she'll get better. And then when I found out she was gone, I was like, okay, we're going to find out that maybe she had a seizure. What had happened is not something I would have in 1,000 years even considered could happen in any way. We live in the country, a small town. Bad stuff doesn't happen out here, especially not to good people. It didn't seem real.
Connie's house was in a rural setting. Search warrants were obtained. As the investigators were processing the scene, they located a knife in the bathtub. We found nothing other than that.
We tried to see if there was any link between Adam, the owner of the truck, and Connie Goodwin in any way. There was no link between Adam and Connie Goodwin. We kept hitting roadblocks along the way, so it was frustrating. We were essentially back to square one. So the detective's primary focus had shifted to Connie's family.
And we knew it was important to find out what happened to Connie by talking to the people that were closer to her. The person who called this in was her sister, Debbie.
And if you just have a seat in one of these, this won't take long at all.
If something happened to Connie, she would most likely be the person that knew about that.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask you some very basic standard questions. And by the way, I'm Sergeant Barker. How do you know Connie?
I know Connie, she's my sister-in-law.
We learned from Debbie that she had made several attempts to try to contact Connie throughout the night and was unable to contact her, and that was not normal to Connie.
Okay, so you went inside calling for Connie, obviously no answer.
In all the rooms. The bathroom door was locked, and so I just started hitting the door, and I kicked it once, and it busted on not the doorknob side. And I saw Connie in the bathtub then.
Tell me what you saw.
Debbie was not thinking about a crime when she entered the residence, but when she looked into the bathtub, everything changed.
You went to check a pulse?
On her neck, but all I felt was bone there. I'm not sure that her head was there or not, because I just remember it being bony.
In my profession, we see tragedy daily, especially working homicide investigations. We see the worst a body could be in. For a normal civilian to witness something like that, you really feel for the people that are put in that situation. So during the investigation, we asked Debbie the most important question for our investigation.
Do you know if she had issues with anybody?
Not that I've heard. They have a son, Aaron, in Arkansas, that has been having some kind of episodes that just kind of strange that she asked us to keep him in prayer. Kind of sounds like maybe he was schizophrenic or something. I don't know.
The information we received about Aaron was not a direct lead, but we can't overlook anything. We learned from Debbie that Aaron was planning on going to Arkansas.
Aaron, that's with Johnny in Arkansas, Connie's husband.
Do you know when they left for Arkansas?
No, I don't.
Debbie said she tried to contact Johnny, Connie's husband, and Aaron by phone and was not able to get a response from any of them.
And they find Connie's been murdered. Obviously, that raised some serious red flags. We could be dealing with a couple of other victims in this situation. And if that was the case, then we possibly had a killer in Hot Springs.
Following Debbie, the detectives interviewed her daughter, Keela, hoping that she could fill in any of the gaps.
You're gonna think I'm crazy, and I don't even know if I'm supposed to say anything. Maybe 6 weeks ago or so, Aaron was involved in some kind of fight with Sharpies, and he says that these people that jumped him and beat him up pretty good have threatened to kill him and then come after his family as well.
We learned that Aaron was in a bar fight with a bald guy with a neck tattoo who he thought was out to get him.
Our investigation shifted to try to figure out who this person was and if he was somehow involved in this incident.
We had a vague description of a tattooed man. That still didn't help us solve this mystery.
The sheriff's department attempted to locate this bald-headed neck tattoo guy. However, nothing was ever discovered.
Nothing about this case was making any sense.
We ran Aaron's name through our database. His dad had reported him missing earlier from the DoubleTree Hotel.
The missing person report had one key detail in that John could still be at the DoubleTree Hotel. John was listed as the contact for any information about Aaron's disappearance.
We needed to locate John. We didn't know whether or not he was alive. There were just too many pieces that weren't making sense or adding up. When we arrived at the DoubleTree Hotel, we did find something a little disturbing.
One of my other daughters called and she said, Aaron is missing. This is my baby brother, and he loved his mom. He was always very protective of her. Like if one of the grandkids might get feisty with grandma, oh no, you don't talk to my mom like that. If he had something to do with this, he was set up. I do remember that was my first reaction.
We had a lot of pieces. A severed head in a stranger's truck, now a missing son, a father who had been heard from. We were hoping just to bring an end to this mystery. So we immediately recognized the address of the DoubleTree Hotel and were able to piece together that Adam, the owner of the truck, had been there previously for a work conference. Later, we went to the DoubleTree. We located Connie's husband, John, in the lobby eating dinner and just asked if he would come down to the station to answer some questions that we had.
John seemed calm and collected and understood why they wanted to speak to him.
Mr. Goodwin, this is Detective Hunter Scott. I'm Detective Sergeant Freeman. Like I said, we're here to ask you about this report, do some follow-up with you about this report you made this morning about your son.
Detectives use different techniques whenever interviewing persons of interest or suspects. Part of them is putting them at ease and also slowly feeding them pieces of information to see what they're willing to give you in return.
Who came up with the idea to come to Hot Springs, you or Aaron?
Well, he wanted to come down here and do his walkabout. I assumed, and I said, why would you come to a city of 35,000 people? But I guess I got to look at the map, and there's a lot of mountains and stuff around.
When John told us, this struck us as odd that you would, drive 400 miles to Hot Springs to go camping on the weekend. And so we pressed John about what had happened before they left for Hot Springs.
Said goodbye to Connie, kiss, and all that. I locked the door behind me. He said, I need you to go to...
He didn't go with you?
No, he stayed there. Okay. So I come home, and here's my driveway. I stopped. He threw the plastic bag in there. He already had his backpack in there, I think. And hopped in, and I said, I already said bye to Mom. Then we left.
So we pushed John a little bit harder to see if we could locate Aaron and to find out his whereabouts.
I brought him down here and rented that place for 3 days. He was going to go on his walkabout. So I went in and rented it. Came back out, he's going through his gear. And he goes, well, yeah, I'll be up in a minute. Went up to the room, probably a span of an hour or so, and I go, something's not right, you know, he's been up here by now. And when I'm down, he's gone. His gear's gone.
After you reported your son missing, you found out that your wife was deceased?
Yeah.
How did you find out?
Well, my son-in-law called me.
Reporting his son missing and then finding out that his wife was deceased, maybe the timing was a little too convenient for this case.
In my years of experience, there's usually a standard reaction to finding out that a loved one is deceased. John didn't seem to portray any of those characteristics. Nothing about that situation was making sense.
So we pushed John a little bit harder about that plastic garbage bag that Aaron was holding at the end of the driveway. If he had ever looked inside the bag, if he knew the contents of the bag.
It does appear that it is your wife. So I think you now maybe can understand a little bit why we're treating this the way that we are and why we're trying to get as much information from you as we possibly can.
Because whatever your son had in that bag, we now have. So if there's anything that you aren't telling us, that you don't know, that we haven't talked about yet, now is the time.
I had nothing from you, fellas. I'm telling you all I know.
We were giving him small bits of information, trying to see if John was involved in this in any way.
So I'm gonna ask you again. If there's something that you're holding back, that you're not wanting to tell us, we need you to tell us. Okay?
Okay.
I'm not accusing you of anything.
Right.
I'm trying to find out what happened with Aaron, where Aaron is.
We immediately thought that he knew more than what he was telling us.
I've been trying to piece this day together. Are you guys believers? Can I ask you that? Are you Christians?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes.
Okay. That might help.
Okay.
I think, I'm not sure. He's not been right. And he thinks God wanting to go on a walkabout and trying to help him.
People try to bring religion into interviews to try to ease their conscience if they do know something more than what they're willing to tell us. They're trying to rationalize it and even personalize it because sometimes the acts are so heinous. And this crime was particularly heinous. John did tell us that Aaron had severe mental health issues.
Has he ever had any psychological help, to your knowledge?
You know, yeah. He was seeing a counselor maybe 3 years ago. I don't know his name. It's all confidential. He was living on his own, and I know that's not the truth. I mean, he's real private.
John had told us that Aaron could have snapped and had a moment of violent rage in which, in that time that he had killed Connie, that was a shifting point in this investigation for us. We had more questions than answers. We had no clear evidence, but the main thing for us was to find Aaron.
Then the video surveillance from DoubleTree came in, and detectives combed through every frame of the video.
When John and Aaron both arrived at the DoubleTree to check in, we'd noticed something terrifying. When John had gone into the hotel, Aaron was seen at the bed of the truck, and he had removed what appeared to be a black garbage bag, and he had placed it into the bed of Adam's truck. The surveillance camera shows he walks to the edge of the wood line there at the hotel, and then we never see Aaron again.
That looks like Aaron disposing of his mother's head, and that's more horrifying than we thought.
All of the evidence at the time is now pointing to Aaron Goodwin. The only problem is that he is still missing. And due to our knowledge of Aaron having severe mental health issues, it was imperative that we found Aaron before he either hurt somebody else or hurt himself. At this time, we believe that Aaron was responsible for the murder of his mother, Connie Goodwin, not his father, John, and not Adam, who discovered the head in his truck.
It's paramount to find him as quickly as possible because there is a severe potential for other people being killed. The search for Aaron became a full-scale, multi-state manhunt. We pushed his name and photo out to the media and urged the public to be vigilant. And the media coverage exploded.
A man wanted in connection to a homicide in Missouri is believed to be in the natural state.
Police are looking for a subject in connection to a Vernon County, Missouri homicide.
Officials found 63-year-old woman dead in her home. Her son is now a suspect in the case, and they believe he is the one who's in Hot Springs.
We got numerous calls of sightings who they believed to be Aaron. We investigated every one of those. They were unfruitful. While searching the Goodwin home, investigators found a series of ominous voicemails left by Aaron.
One message that the family received from Aaron Goodwin was particularly disturbing.
Sunday, 1:43 p.m. You guys have got to get out of there. Do not be home on Halloween. I'm serious. John, you got to renounce Emmanuel as the Savior. Go back to Jesus. I'm not you. The Aryans are coming.
When you hear it from his own voice, he's talking about aliens and things that obviously aren't true. There's a lot of concern there.
Aaron's mental health was quickly deteriorating. It shifted for us to make sure that we protected the public.
During the course of the investigation, we would track credit card information, try to find cell phone information. There was no activity on Aaron after he walked out of the parking lot of the hotel. We figured he was in the woods. There was ground searches conducted by Arkansas authorities throughout that wooded area, the large national forest. And here in Missouri, we continued to follow up on any leads that would come in.
It was extremely frustrating and tiring to try to do the same thing over and over again and not make any headway. But we were hoping just to bring an end to this mystery.
In March of 2021, 5 months after Connie's murder and Aaron's disappearance, we got the break we were looking for. A hiker stumbled across remains in a sleeping bag along with a gun in a wooded area outside of Hot Springs.
I guarantee you, let me see your glove. The rest of the body's there.
Yeah, I was sticking out on that.
Feet.
The state of the body was in severe decomposition, was mainly skeletal.
I mean, the skull's bleached out. The pieces of it are. And I can see insect activity, though, where the neck used to be in the jacket. I can see that. I'll pick one person on the body, and then I'm going to hike out.
The officers that responded to the scene were able to put the pieces together that this could potentially be Aaron Goodwin.
There's a body and a sleeping bag.
You can see the arm of the jacket.
You can see the arm of the jacket, but I don't see any arms or hands. But there's a backpack next to it. But I'm not going to touch that backpack. You know what? I wonder if it could be. This guy's been. When was that?
Aaron was still out there, and maybe this could be him. We were hopeful that it was him, so we could put an end to this mystery.
We got to get all the information. I need someone to stay with the body, though. Or at least, you don't have to stay with the body, but
I'll walk out with them and get their info.
Not long after the body was discovered, we were able to determine that the remains did belong to Aaron Goodwin. His death was ruled by a medical examiner to be suicide, which ended the manhunt. We were still left with more questions than answers. Why did he kill his mother and not his father? Did Aaron believe that his mother was possessed?
Those are questions that unfortunately leave the family with a lot more questions than answers.
So based on all the evidence that was collected and the interviews that were conducted and knowing that his mental health was pretty severe, I think Aaron Goodwin had a psychotic break, was ultimately responsible for killing his mom, Connie Goodwin, removing her head from her body, placing it in a garbage bag, and then driving it to Hot Springs, where it ended up in the back of Adam's truck.
Thing that I miss a lot about my mom is she would always call And she would talk for hours and hours. And I would be like, oh, Lord, she's still talking. But I miss that. I miss that. I mean hours, 2-3 hours. She would talk about everything. Work, her garden, the other grandkids, the next visit, the next holiday, just for hours and hours. And I miss those phone calls. She always had this way of knowing if I was sick or sad, and I would just get a phone call. And she would say, you are on my heart.
We'll never know what truly happened in the moment, and we'll never truly know why. There just won't ever be answers. And that's probably the hardest part. Like, how does this happen? Why does this happen to two perfectly loving people in a family for seemingly no reason? And then how do you prevent it from happening in the future if you don't know why it happened at all? I've also thought a lot about what I would say to Aaron. Honestly, I think I would just say, I forgive you and I love you.
The call came in just before sunrise, a voice stripped of identity and emotion, measured but urgent, as if the person on the other end had rehearsed these words for years and finally reached the moment where silence felt more dangerous than exposure. No name was given, no request for protection. Just a sentence that landed like a gunshot in a quiet room. A sentence that reopened a file buried so deep it had almost fused with history. Arizona, 2001, cold case. A disappearance that never stopped haunting the desert. A name investigators had not spoken aloud in years, suddenly dragged back into the light. In 2001, Arizona was a place where space swallowed people whole. Long highways with no witnesses. Subdivisions fading into scrubland. Heat that erased details and warped memory. It was a landscape built for secrets. And on one unremarkable night, it became the final backdrop for a woman who walked out of her apartment and never returned. No screams. No neighbors rushing outside. No alarms. Just the quiet click of a door closing and the desert doing what it does best. Absorbing. She was last seen just after nightfall. Casual clothes. No luggage. Keys in hand. No indication she planned to go far or stay gone long. Her car remained parked where she left it, untouched, unlocked, a detail that would later gnaw on investigators because it suggested interruption, not intention. Inside her apartment, nothing appeared disturbed. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. The kind of scene that offers nothing and dares you to make sense of it anyway. By morning, concern hardened into fear. Calls went unanswered. Work reported her absence. Family members felt that instinctive alarm that arrives when routine breaks without explanation. Police were notified, and the first officers on scene did what protocol demanded. They looked. They listened. They found nothing. No blood. No struggle. No clear reason to upgrade the case from missing person to crime. And yet, something felt wrong. Friends described her as predictable, cautious, anchored to habit. She didn't disappear. She didn't vanish without a word. Coworkers confirmed she had future plans, deadlines, commitments that extended well beyond that night. The more investigators learned about her, the less plausible a voluntary disappearance became. This was not escape. This was removal. The community reacted fast. Flyers appeared on grocery store doors, gas station windows, telephone poles baking under the sun. Candlelight vigils gathered strangers who felt compelled to stand together against uncertainty. Local news stations ran her photograph until it blurred into familiarity, until viewers began to recognize her without remembering why. Tips flooded in, sightings from other towns, other states, some earnest, some cruel, all unverified. Detectives worked through the early phase with intensity, knowing those first hours mattered more than any others. They traced phone records, limited as they were at the time. They checked nearby businesses door to door, hoping someone had noticed something small, something forgettable that might now be essential. They followed her routine backward, reconstructing the day piece by piece, searching for the moment where normal cracked. Suspicion followed its usual path, spiraling outward from the center of her life. Friends, Co-workers, former partners, anyone who knew her schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities. Interviews were conducted in living rooms and police stations, stories told and retold, alibis offered, timelines sketched on notepads. Most people cooperated. Some bristled. One name surfaced more than once, not as an accusation, but as a coincidence too persistent to ignore. This person was familiar to her, close enough to be trusted, ordinary enough to disappear into the background. Someone whose connection did not raise alarms in 2001 because familiarity was mistaken for safety. Detectives noted the name, asked questions, checked records. Nothing concrete emerged. No physical evidence. No witnesses. No contradictions strong enough to justify further action. The name remained in the file, underlined but unresolved. Weeks turned into months. The desert erased what little trace might have existed. Wind reshaped terrain. Construction crept outward, pouring concrete over emptiness, sealing possibilities beneath development and progress. The urgency that defined the early days softened. New cases arrived. Louder cases. Cases with bodies, with blood, with answers waiting to be uncovered. Her file thickened but cooled, each added page another reminder of what was missing. By the end of the first year, the case was no longer active in the way families understand that word. It remained open, technically, but it lived in a different category now, one reserved for questions without leverage. Detectives rotated out. Leads dried up. The city learned to say her name less often. Her family never did. They learned how to exist inside the absence. Holidays became exercises in endurance. Birthdays passed with no candles lit. They called the department regularly, asking if anything had changed, if any new information had surfaced. The answers were always careful, always vague, always the same. Nothing yet. Years passed. Technology evolved. Databases grew smarter. Cold cases across the country were revived by DNA, by digital trails that hadn't existed when the crimes occurred. Her case was reviewed more than once, pulled from the shelf, examined, returned. Each time, the conclusion echoed the last. No body, no crime scene, no prosecutable evidence. The desert remained silent. Then came a call. The anonymous tip did not wander. It did not speculate. It did not ask questions. It offered specifics. A location that had never been thoroughly examined. A connection that had been dismissed as insignificant in 2001. A name that had never quite left the margins of the investigation. The voice did not tremble. It did not rush. It spoke with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it now. Detectives reopened the file before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Dust lifted from folders. Old photographs resurfaced, faces frozen in a time before everything fractured. The name mentioned in the call was instantly recognizable. A person questioned briefly in the early days and then released back into normal life. No follow-up, no surveillance, no reason at the time to push harder. Now, there was reason. They moved carefully, aware that anonymous tips can unravel cases as easily as they can solve them. But this one aligned too neatly with details that had never settled correctly. A timeline that had always been slightly off. A statement that had been offered too quickly, too smoothly. A detail about that night shared before it was publicly known. Investigators began retracing old steps with new eyes. Addresses revisited. Records re-examined. People who had aged into anonymity were contacted again, their memories brittle but not entirely gone. Some cooperated eagerly, relieved to unburden themselves after years of carrying unease. Others resisted, claiming they remembered nothing, insisting the past should stay buried. The location mentioned in the tip was unremarkable on the surface. In 2001, it had been empty land, accessible, unmonitored, forgettable. Now it sat on the edge of development, transformed but not erased. A place people passed without noticing. The kind of place secrets choose when they want to remain undiscovered. Ground-penetrating radar was requested. Paperwork moved with a speed that betrayed the tension beneath it. No announcements were made. No press briefings. But rumors began to circulate because cold cases have a way of waking people up. Online forums stirred. Old message boards resurfaced. A story that had slept for 2 decades was stirring again. The night she disappeared was no longer a closed chapter. It was reopening, dragging the present toward it. Detectives felt that familiar, dangerous mixture of hope and dread. Hope that answers might finally exist. Dread that those answers would confirm what had long been suspected, but never proven. As the sun set once more over the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across ground that had held its silence for far too long, the case shifted, just slightly, just enough to signal that the truth, whatever it was done waiting. The desert did not look different when they returned to it, but the way the detectives saw it had changed, because once a cold case begins to stir, every stretch of land starts to feel like a witness that has simply been waiting too long to speak. The location from the anonymous tip sat on the outskirts of town, a forgotten scene between old Arizona and the version that had grown over it, where scrub met half-finished development and the wind carried dust the way it always had, indifferent to time, indifferent to memory. Back in 2001, this place had been nothing. No cameras, no fences, no reason to stop or look twice. It was the kind of land people used briefly and then erase from their minds, the kind of land someone would choose if they believed the desert could absorb anything without consequence. Investigators stood there now, reading maps and old zoning records, matching coordinates to memories, trying to overlay the present onto the past without losing what mattered in between. They did not dig immediately. Cold cases punish impatience. Instead, they walked the perimeter, marking subtle changes in elevation, noting unnatural lines where earth had been disturbed and then smoothed over again. The desert hides its scars well, but it never heals them completely. It remembers pressure. It remembers weight. As preparations moved forward, detectives turned back to people, because land only tells part of the story. They reopened interviews that had been conducted in cramped rooms 2 decades earlier, voices recorded on outdated equipment, questions shaped by what investigators thought they understood at the time. Now they listened again, slower, catching the pauses that had once been ignored, the answers that had been too polished to be true. The name from the tip resurfaced everywhere they looked. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to be unavoidable. This person had been present in the woman's life in ways that now felt too consistent to dismiss. Shared routines, familiar access, the ability to move unnoticed. In 2001, it had seemed ordinary. In hindsight, it felt deliberate. Neighbors from that time struggled to remember specifics. Faces blurred, dates collapsed into general impressions. But certain things remained sharp. A vehicle parked where it didn't belong. A voice heard late at night that didn't match anyone else's. A moment that had felt strange, but not dangerous enough to act on. Memory is selective, but it is also stubborn. One former acquaintance hesitated before speaking, then admitted they had always been uncomfortable with how quickly this person inserted themselves into the aftermath of the disappearance. Offering help, asking questions, presenting concern that felt rehearsed. At the time, grief explained everything. Now, distance stripped those gestures of their innocence. Investigators documented every detail, aware that none of it would matter unless it could be anchored to evidence. They needed more than suspicion. They needed something that could survive scrutiny, something that could turn a reopened case into a viable one. Ground-penetrating radar arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no media vans, just technicians unloading equipment under a sky bleached white by the sun. The scans began slowly, methodically, the machine translating invisible disturbances into data that hinted at what lay beneath. For hours, the results were unremarkable. Flat, clean, disappointing. Then came the first irregularity. Subtle, easy to dismiss if you weren't looking for it. A patch where the soil density shifted unnaturally, inconsistent with the surrounding ground. The technician ran the scan again. The anomaly remained. Not definitive, but persistent. Detectives marked the spot and stepped back. Experience had taught them caution. Too many cold cases have been damaged by premature conclusions. But this was enough to proceed, enough to justify the next step. As paperwork moved through the system, investigators turned their attention back to timelines. The night of the disappearance was reconstructed again, minute by minute, using everything they had and everything technology now allowed. Phone records, limited but not useless. Old receipts, witness statements re-examined in sequence rather than isolation. Something began to emerge. A window of time that had always existed but had never been fully interrogated. A gap where movements overlapped too neatly. Where one person's alibi relied on another person's assumption. Where certainty had been built on trust rather than verification. The suspect from the tip sat squarely inside that window. They pulled financial records from the period, discovering transactions that had once seemed meaningless. Cash withdrawals. Purchases that suggested preparation rather than spontaneity. Items that could be explained individually, but together formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The detectives felt the pressure building, the familiar sense that the case was accelerating whether they were ready or not. Cold cases do not unfold gently once they begin to thaw. They lurch forward, forcing decisions, demanding precision. When excavation was finally approved, it was done quietly, under conditions that discouraged spectacle. The site was secured at dawn, tapes stretching across ground that had looked unremarkable for decades. Shovels broke the surface carefully, each layer removed with attention bordering on reverence. This was no longer just a search. It was an intrusion into a long-held secret. Hours passed with nothing to show but dirt and rock. Doubt crept in, unwelcome but familiar. Then a change. A texture that didn't belong. Soil that had been compacted differently, layered with intent rather than accident. The team slowed further, switching to tools designed for patience rather than progress. What they uncovered was incomplete, fragmented, but enough to change everything. Human remains, disturbed by time, but unmistakable. The desert had finally released what it had been holding. The site went silent. Protocol took over. Documentation. Preservation. Calls made quietly, voices low. The moment investigators had imagined for years arrived without drama, heavy and irreversible. News traveled fast despite efforts to contain it. Rumors escaped before confirmations could follow. Social media ignited. Arizona felt the shift almost immediately, the way communities do when a story they thought was finished demands attention again. The family was notified first. The words they had waited decades to hear arrived stripped of comfort. Remains had been found. Identification would take time. Nothing was certain yet. Hope and grief collided in a way that defied language. As forensic teams worked the site, detectives turned fully toward the suspect. The discovery did not prove guilt, but collapsed the space where denial had lived. The case was no longer theoretical. It had weight. It had a location. The suspect was brought in for questioning, this time under a different light. Years had changed them. Age had softened some edges and sharpened others. The confidence from 2001 was replaced by caution. Answers came slower. Silence stretched longer. They denied everything, expressed shock, claimed confusion, but the ease was gone. The desert, it seemed, had taken something with it when it gave up the truth. As night fell over Arizona once more, the case that had haunted the state for more than 20 years crossed a line it could never return from. The cold case was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming a reckoning, and the desert, having finally spoken, was not done yet. The desert kept its silence while the city found its voice again, because once human remains are discovered, a cold case stops being a question and starts becoming an accusation, even before the evidence has finished speaking. The site was sealed, photographed, measured, every grain of disturbed earth treated as if it carried memory, because in a case this old, memory is often all that survives intact. Investigators moved with deliberate restraint, knowing that the smallest mistake now could fracture what had finally begun to align. Forensic teams worked beneath the sun, cataloging fragments that time had tried to erase. Bone exposed to heat and pressure, fabric reduced to threads, objects stripped of context until only their placement told a story. Nothing emerged all at once. There was no single moment of revelation, just a slow accumulation of confirmation that this was not coincidence, not contamination, not ancient remains forgotten by history. This was recent enough to matter, human enough to hurt. Back at the department, the case file grew heavy again, no longer with speculation, but with substance. The discovery rewired every conversation. Detectives stopped speaking in hypotheticals. Language sharpened. The woman's name returned to reports without qualifiers like missing or presumed. The past was no longer abstract. It was measurable. Identification would take time. Dental records. DNA comparisons. The science was precise but patient, indifferent to the urgency felt by everyone else. While that process unfolded, investigators pressed forward because the ground had offered them leverage they had never possessed before. They brought the suspect in again, this time not as a courtesy interview, but as a formal interrogation. The room was smaller than the desert, intentionally so. No windows, no distractions, just a table, a recorder, and decades of unresolved history pressing in from every angle. The suspect sat differently now, shoulders tense, hands clasped too tightly. The confidence that had once framed their answers was replaced by calculation. Questions began simply. Where were you in 2001? Who did you speak to that night? Why had you volunteered information before being asked? The answers came carefully, layered with rehearsed clarity, but the pauses between them betrayed effort. Silence stretched. Detectives let it. Silence, after all, had been the suspect's greatest ally for 20 years. They introduced details slowly, never revealing more than necessary. The location, the timing, the alignment of movements that placed the suspect in proximity not just to the woman, but to the place where the desert had finally spoken. The suspect denied everything, predictably, but denial now sounded defensive rather than assured. Outside the room, analysts reconstructed timelines with forensic precision. Cell tower pings that had once been too crude to matter were now reinterpreted with modern modeling. Vehicle records were cross-referenced with fuel purchases. A route emerged that fit too neatly to dismiss. Not proof, but pressure. The community watched from a distance, stunned by the speed at which a forgotten story had returned to relevance. News anchors spoke the woman's name with gravity, reminding viewers of the year, the waiting, the unanswered questions. Social media filled the gaps with speculation, outrage, certainty. Public opinion formed faster than evidence ever could. The family remained mostly silent, retreating into privacy as the world rediscovered their pain. They had learned long ago that hope attracts noise. Now, they waited again, this time not for a return, but for acknowledgement. Identification would confirm what their hearts had already accepted. Still, confirmation mattered. Forensic results began to arrive in fragments. Age consistent with the woman. Sex consistent. Trauma suggested restraint, not accident. A methodical act rather than impulsive violence. Each detail tightened the narrative investigators had carried quietly for years. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was familiarity weaponized. They returned to the site, this time with purpose. Additional excavation revealed more context. The positioning suggested intent. The depth suggested confidence. Whoever had chosen this place believed it would never be revisited, believed the desert would finish what they had started. That belief had held for 2 decades. Until now, detectives expanded their focus beyond the primary suspect, mapping relationships, identifying who else might have known, who else might have stayed silent. Secrets rarely exist alone. They cluster. They draw others into orbit. Some witnesses were cooperative now, unburdened by time. Others resisted, still protecting something or someone. One interview shifted the tone entirely. A former acquaintance, distant enough to feel safe but close enough to know details, admitted they had suspected something for years. A late-night phone call, a request for help that never made sense until now. They hadn't gone to police in 2001 because nothing concrete had happened yet. Then time passed. Then silence became habit. This testimony did not stand alone, but it fit. Another piece settling into place. Investigators documented it carefully, aware that memory can be shaped by hindsight. But the specificity mattered. The consistency mattered. The suspect was questioned again. This time, the strategy changed. Detectives stopped asking what happened and started asking why. Why choose that location? Why that night? Why the behavior afterward? The suspect grew agitated, deflecting, accusing investigators of targeting them unfairly, of resurrecting a past that had already been examined. The interrogators did not argue. They did not need to. They let the evidence speak, quietly, relentlessly. They let the suspect confront the reality that the desert no longer protected them. An arrest warrant began to take shape, not yet executed, but outlined, reviewed, stress-tested by prosecutors who understood the stakes. A cold case arrest carries weight beyond the individual. It tests the system's ability to correct itself. It invites scrutiny. It demands precision. When the DNA results came back, they closed the circle. A match. Not perfect, not cinematic, but sufficient. Sufficient to confirm identity. Sufficient to connect the remains to the woman who had vanished in 2001. The missing person was now a homicide victim. The case had crossed its final threshold. The arrest was made quietly, without spectacle. No early morning raid. No cameras tipped off in advance. Just officers at a door, decades late, carrying a warrant that represented the end of one kind of waiting and the beginning of another. The suspect did not resist. Shock registered briefly, then settled into something like resignation. Arizona woke up to the news hours later. Cold case cracked. Anonymous tip leads to shocking arrest. The words moved faster than understanding ever could. For the public, it felt sudden. For investigators, it felt inevitable. As the suspect was processed, booked, fingerprinted, the weight of the moment pressed in. Years of silence had not erased the crime. They had only delayed its reckoning. The desert had kept the truth intact long enough for it to matter again. That night, as lights dimmed in offices and the city returned to routine, the case remained awake. Evidence still needed to be argued. Motives still needed clarity. Justice still had distance to travel. But something fundamental had changed. The story was no longer about disappearance. It was about confrontation. About what happens when a secret survives long enough to believe it has won, only to be dragged back into the light by a single voice that decided silence had finally cost too much. The arrest did not bring relief. It brought pressure, the kind that tightens rather than releases, because once a suspect is in custody, every unanswered question becomes louder, every gap more dangerous. The case had moved from investigation to confrontation, and Arizona felt the shift immediately. The air thick with expectation, the public hungry for clarity that the system could not yet provide. Inside the department, the pace accelerated. Detectives worked in overlapping shifts, unwilling to leave momentum unattended. Evidence was no longer theoretical. It had names. It had coordinates. It had consequences. Every decision now carried the weight of scrutiny, not just from prosecutors and defense attorneys, but from a community that had waited more than 20 years to see whether the truth could still hold. The suspect sat in a holding cell that felt too small for the history surrounding it. 20 years of silence pressed in, invisible but relentless. When questioning resumed, it was different this time. The tone was no longer exploratory. It was deliberate, surgical. Investigators were no longer asking whether something had happened. They were asking how much of it the suspect was willing to admit. The suspect's demeanor shifted hour by hour. At first, denial remained firm, rehearsed phrases deployed like shields. Then came irritation, then fatigue. Long pauses followed questions that once would have been answered quickly. Time, the very thing that had protected them for decades, now worked against them. Detectives laid out the narrative carefully, never rushing, never revealing too much at once. They spoke of proximity, not motive. Opportunity, not intent. They let the suspect hear their own past reframed through evidence rather than memory. The location. The timing. The pattern of behavior before and after the disappearance. Each piece was introduced calmly, methodically, until denial began to sound thin even to the person speaking it. Outside the interrogation room, prosecutors assembled their strategy with equal intensity. Cold case prosecutions are fragile by nature. Memories degrade. Evidence ages. Defense teams thrive on doubt, and doubt multiplies with time. Every element needed to be anchored not just in theory, but in fact that could withstand attack. They revisited every step taken in 2001, identifying weaknesses before the defense could exploit them. Why certain leads hadn't been followed. Why certain assumptions had been made. The prosecution knew they would be asked to explain the past as much as they were asked to prove the present. Forensic specialists continued their work, extracting as much information as possible from remains altered by years underground. Trauma analysis confirmed restraint. Positioning suggested familiarity rather than panic. There were no signs of struggle that involved strangers. Everything pointed inward toward someone known, trusted, close enough to act without drawing attention. That conclusion echoed through witness statements collected decades apart. Friends remembered subtle changes in the suspect after the disappearance. Increased isolation, heightened control, a sudden desire to leave town, explained at the time as coincidence. Now, those memories resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. One witness described an argument overheard days before the woman vanished. Not violent, not overtly threatening, just tension, unresolved and sharp. At the time, it had been dismissed as ordinary conflict. Now it felt like a warning that had gone unrecognized. The suspect defense team moved quickly, issuing statements that framed the arrest as premature, the result of public pressure rather than proof. They emphasized the age of the case, the degradation of evidence, the danger of hindsight bias. Every argument was designed to remind people that certainty feels stronger than it actually is. Media coverage intensified. Headlines grew bolder. Cold case cracked. Shocking arrest. Desert secret revealed. The language fed public emotion, but it also risked contaminating the process. Judges warned against speculation. Attorneys cautioned restraint. The system braced itself. The family remained largely silent, shielded by distance and exhaustion. For them, the arrest was not a victory. It was a threshold, a point beyond which there was no return to waiting, only the long, grueling path toward acknowledgement. They had learned not to equate movement with progress. Behind closed doors, detectives confronted their own reckoning. Some had been young officers when the case first opened. Others had inherited it as a cautionary tale. Now, they stood at the edge of resolution that would never feel complete. They reviewed their notes, their choices, the moments where different decisions might have changed everything. There was no comfort in that exercise, only responsibility. The suspect requested counsel. Questioning paused. Silence returned, but this time it was not protective. It was heavy, crowded with evidence that no longer needed words to exist. Investigators had what they needed to move forward. Whether it would be enough in court was another matter entirely. As the case moved toward preliminary hearings, the city leaned in. Courtrooms filled. Reporters competed for space. Every motion was dissected. Every procedural step framed as either progress or failure. The justice system, slow by design, felt painfully inadequate to those watching from the outside. Prosecutors presented the outline of their case, careful not to overreach. They emphasized consistency, corroboration, the convergence of independent elements that pointed in the same direction. They acknowledged the time gap openly, refusing to pretend it didn't exist. Instead, they framed it as context, not weakness. The defense countered with familiar tactics, attacking memory, questioning motives, suggesting alternative explanations that required no evidence, only imagination. They painted the investigation as a narrative constructed after the fact, shaped by the discovery of remains rather than driven by proof. The judge listened, impassive, aware that this stage was not about verdicts but thresholds. Probable cause, legal sufficiency, whether the case deserved to move forward. The decision carried weight beyond this courtroom. It spoke to the system's willingness to confront its past. When the ruling came, it was measured, restrained, but decisive. The case would proceed. There was enough alignment, enough substance, enough reason to let a jury hear the story in full. The announcement rippled outward. Relief, anger, fear, hope. Each reaction coexisted uneasily, reflecting the complexity of a case that had refused simplicity from the beginning. The desert had yielded remains. The investigation had yielded a suspect. Now the legal process would test whether truth could survive translation into law. As preparations for trial began, investigators returned once more to the beginning to ensure nothing had been missed. They walked the path the woman had likely taken that night, imagining choices she never knew she was making. They stood at the excavation site, now sealed again, and felt the strange finality of knowing where she had been all those years. The case no longer belonged solely to the past. It had entered the present with force, demanding attention, precision, and endurance. The cold case was no longer cold, but it was far from settled. And beneath the noise, beneath the headlines and arguments, one truth remained unchanged. A life had been taken, hidden, and held in silence for 2 decades. Now that silence had been broken, and everyone involved understood that what came next would determine not just guilt or innocence, but whether time itself could be challenged without losing what little justice it still allowed. The trial calendar did not wait for emotion to catch up, and as dates were set and motions filed, the case settled into a rhythm that felt both relentless and unreal. Because for the family and the city, this was the climax of a story decades in the making. While for the court it was procedure, deadlines, evidence lists, and rules that cared nothing for how long the truth had been delayed. The desert had spoken, but now the law demanded translation, and translation is where certainty often fractures. Pre-trial hearings exposed the fault lines immediately. The defense moved aggressively, challenging the admissibility of everything that carried the weight of time. Witness memories were attacked as contaminated by media exposure. Forensic conclusions were questioned because soil, heat, and years underground distort clarity. Even the anonymous tip itself was framed as suspect, its timing too convenient, its source unknowable, its motives impossible to test. Doubt was their currency, and they spent it freely. Prosecutors responded with restraint. They did not argue perfection. They argued convergence. Independent elements aligning without coordination. Physical evidence meeting behavioral patterns. Testimony echoing conclusions reached long before the remains were ever found. They emphasized that cold cases are not solved by a single revelation, but by accumulation, by the slow tightening of probability until coincidence can no longer breathe. The judge ruled carefully, excluding some material, allowing others, shaping a case that felt narrower than the one investigators carried in their minds, but strong enough to proceed. Each ruling felt like a small victory or a sharp loss, depending on where you stood, but taken together, they formed the boundaries within which truth would have to survive. Jury selection became its own quiet battle. Potential jurors admitted familiarity with the case, some from years ago, others from recent headlines. Many were excused. Those who remained spoke cautiously, aware that they were stepping into something larger than themselves. They were asked if they could separate emotion from evidence, history from proof, outrage from judgment. Some said yes without hesitation. Others paused before answering, and those pauses mattered. When opening statements finally arrived, the courtroom felt compressed, every seat filled, every breath audible. Prosecutors began not with the arrest, not with the tip, but with the ordinary night that fractured without warning. They spoke of familiarity, of access, of trust exploited quietly. They painted the desert not as villain, but as accomplice, a landscape that does not ask questions and does not interrupt. The defense followed with equal confidence, framing the case as a reconstruction rather than a record, a story assembled long after the fact, driven by discovery rather than evidence. They reminded jurors of the years that had passed, of the danger of certainty born from hindsight. They spoke of presumption, of the burden of proof, of the irreversible cost of getting it wrong. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Friends, co-workers, investigators old and new. Each voice added texture, but also friction, because memory does not age evenly. Some recollections were vivid, others vague. The defense seized on inconsistencies, small differences amplified into questions about reliability. The prosecution countered by showing that the core remained unchanged even as details blurred. When forensic experts testified, the room leaned forward. Charts, diagrams, clinical language describing trauma without emotion. The restraint suggested control. The positioning suggested planning. The conclusions were careful, framed in probabilities rather than absolutes, but they pointed inward towards someone who knew her, someone who could act without force or witnesses. Cross-examination was relentless. Could animals have altered the remains? Could the location have been accessed by anyone? Could the timeline be wrong? Each question chipped at certainty, not enough to break it, but enough to test its resilience. The experts held steady, acknowledging limitations without retreating from conclusions. The anonymous tip hovered over the trial like a ghost, never fully visible, never entirely absent. The defense questioned its credibility, suggesting manipulation, revenge, or coincidence. The prosecution treated it as catalyst rather than cornerstone, emphasizing that the case did not depend on who made the call, only on what the call led to. The suspect sat through it all, expression controlled, eyes forward, no visible reaction as witnesses spoke of patterns and proximity. No outward response as the desert site was described in detail. Jurors watched closely, knowing they were not supposed to read meaning into demeanor, knowing they would anyway. As days passed, the weight of the years became unavoidable. Jurors heard about missed opportunities, about technologies that did not exist in 2001, about assumptions made because the absence of evidence felt like evidence of absence. The prosecution did not hide these realities. They acknowledged them, framing the delay as context rather than failure. The defense, however, turned the delay into a central argument. They suggested the investigation had been shaped backward, that once remains were found, everything else was bent to fit a conclusion. They asked jurors to imagine alternate explanations, alternate actors, alternate narratives that required no proof, only possibility. Closing arguments distilled the tension into its rawest form. The prosecution asked jurors to consider the totality, to see how each piece reinforced the others. They spoke of silence as action, of how trust can be the most effective weapon. They did not promise certainty. They promised coherence. The defense urged restraint. They warned against conviction driven by emotion or sympathy. They reminded jurors that the law does not exist to heal wounds, but to prevent irreversible mistakes. They argued that doubts still lived in the gaps time had carved. Deliberations began under a cloud of expectation. The jury disappeared behind closed doors, carrying decades of waiting with them. Hours passed, then days. Speculation filled the void outside. Inside, the jurors wrestled not just with evidence, but with the responsibility of deciding whether the past could be judged fairly in the present. When the verdict finally came, it landed without drama. No gasps, no outbursts. Guilty. The word echoed softly, almost anticlimactically, as if the courtroom itself had exhausted its capacity for reaction. The suspect lowered their head briefly, then looked forward again. Control, intact to the end. The family absorbed the moment in silence. Tears came later, privately, where no one could mistake them for relief. The verdict did not restore what had been taken. It did not compress 20 years into a moment of balance. It acknowledged harm. It named responsibility. That was all. Sentencing followed weeks later, methodical and restrained. The judge spoke of the time lost, the life interrupted, the cost of silence. The sentence reflected gravity rather than vengeance. There were no words capable of matching the weight of what had happened, and none were expected to. Outside the courthouse, the city exhaled unevenly. Some felt justice had finally arrived. Others felt uneasy, unsettled by how long it had taken and how imperfect it felt. Cold cases, after all, rarely deliver clean endings. They leave residue. As a defendant was led away, the desert reclaimed its role as backdrop rather than participant. The site where remains had been found was sealed, unremarkable once more. Life resumed its forward motion, but not unchanged. The case was no longer unsolved. The mystery had given way to accountability. Yet something lingered, a quiet awareness that time had altered everything it touched, including justice itself. The cold case had been cracked, but it had left behind a truth that would never fully settle, a reminder that answers, when delayed long enough, arrive carrying both weight and loss in equal measure. The verdict did not end the story, because cold cases never truly conclude when a courtroom empties, and in the weeks that followed, the city began to process what it meant to live after an answer finally arrived. News vans packed up. Headlines shifted. But beneath the surface, something had changed permanently, a subtle recalibration of memory, suspicion, and trust that moved quietly through neighborhoods like heat trapped in asphalt long after sunset. For investigators, the case became study material. Files were digitized, timelines reconstructed again, this time not to find the truth, but to understand how close it had always been. Detectives who had retired returned to briefing rooms, older now, slower in step, carrying the weight of decisions made when technology was thinner and pressure heavier. They spoke candidly about assumptions, about blind spots shaped by the era, about how familiarity can dull suspicion when everyone involved appears normal. The anonymous tipster remained unknown, their voice fading back into silence as abruptly as it had emerged. Speculation followed, inevitable and unprovable. Some believed it was guilt finally surfacing. Others suspected fear or leverage or a moment of clarity brought on by age. Investigators refused to indulge publicly. The tip had done its job. Motive no longer mattered. But privately, the question lingered, because it always does when truth arrives through shadow. The family began the slow work of reassembling life around an absence that had defined them for decades. Closure was a word used freely by outsiders, but within the family, it felt inaccurate, almost offensive. Nothing had closed. A chapter had been forced into punctuation, yes, but the story itself remained unfinished in every meaningful way. Holidays still carried empty chairs. Photographs still stopped time at a version of her that never aged. They spoke occasionally to the press, not to relive details, but to remind viewers that waiting is its own form of trauma. They described the years as a suspended sentence, one handed down without explanation or end date. Justice, when it came, felt less like relief and more like permission to grieve honestly, without the constant pressure to hope. The defendant's past became public property. Old acquaintances were interviewed. Former co-workers searched memories for overlooked moments, jokes that now felt wrong, silences that now felt deliberate. Ordinary interactions were retrofitted with meaning. The media framed these revelations as warning signs, but those who had lived them knew the truth was Messier. Monsters rarely announce themselves. They blend. They attend barbecues. They remember birthdays. Psychologists weighed in, discussing compartmentalization, the ability to maintain a normal exterior while carrying something unspeakable inside. They spoke of control, of the long-term psychological toll of secrecy, of how time does not erase guilt but buries it deeper, where it can ferment. These analyses were clinical, detached, but they resonated because they offered structure to something otherwise incomprehensible. The desert, too, drew renewed attention. Reporters returned to the site, filming wide shots of empty land, emphasizing isolation. Viewers saw nothing remarkable, which was the point. The landscape had not changed. It had simply waited. Locals expressed quiet resentment at the sudden interest, at how tragedy briefly transformed their home into a symbol before moving on. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note. Cold case units reference the investigation as proof that persistence, paired with advancing technology, could yield results even after decades. Training seminars dissected the use of tips, the reopening of evidence, the importance of revisiting assumptions without ego. The case became instructional, stripped of emotion for professional consumption. But for those closest to it, emotion was unavoidable. Detectives admitted to sleepless nights after the verdict, not from doubt, but from reflection. They replayed early interviews, wondering how different questions might have changed everything. Some felt vindicated. Others felt haunted. All understood that solving the case did not absolve the past. The community grappled with trust. The realization that someone so close could be responsible reshaped social dynamics, subtly but persistently. Parents became more cautious. Friendships were reevaluated. The case served as a reminder that proximity does not equal safety, that danger can exist within familiarity without leaving obvious marks. Online forums erupted with debate. Armchair investigators dissected transcripts, argued over evidence, proposed alternate theories despite the verdict. This digital afterlife of the case revealed a modern truth. Resolution does not silence speculation. If anything, it fuels it. The internet does not accept endings easily. It prefers ambiguity, loose threads, the possibility of reversal. The judge's written opinion was published weeks later, outlining the reasoning behind sentencing decisions. It was precise, unemotional, focused on facts rather than narrative. Yet between the lines was an acknowledgement of time's distortion, of how justice delayed demands a different kind of language. The opinion would be cited in future cases. Another way this story would persist beyond those directly involved. In prison, the defendant entered a new anonymity. Intake forms replaced headlines. A number replaced a name. Reports surfaced of isolation, of minimal communication, of a continued refusal to explain. Silence remained the final act of control, denying the world any further insight, any confession that might have simplified the story. The family learned to live without answers to certain questions. Why that night? Why that method? Why wait so long? These questions circled endlessly, never landing. Therapists encouraged acceptance, not resolution. Some questions, they said, are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be carried. Anniversaries took on new meaning. The date of disappearance now shared space with the date of arrest, the date of remains discovery, the date of verdict. Time fractured into reference points, each one marking a different version of pain. Public commemorations were quieter now, more personal. Candles lit without cameras. Names spoken without explanation. The case influenced policy discussions quietly. Funding for cold case units was debated. Resources were allocated, then reallocated. Lawmakers cited the investigation as evidence of value, a return on investment measured not in dollars, but in accountability. Progress moved slowly, as it always does, but it moved. For journalists who had covered the case, there was a sense of unease after filing final stories. The ending resisted tidy framing. Editors wanted closure. Reality offered complexity. Some stories focused on triumph. Others emphasized tragedy. None captured everything. None ever could. Late at night, when traffic thinned and the city settled into its familiar rhythm, the case receded from daily thought but never disappeared entirely. It lingered in small moments, in sudden silences, in the awareness that truth can hide in plain sight for years, waiting for the right fracture to reveal it. The cold case was no longer cold, but its temperature had not warmed. It remained something sharp and unsettling, a reminder that time does not heal all wounds. It merely changes their shape. And as Arizona moved forward, carrying the weight of a story finally spoken aloud, one truth remained unavoidable. Some answers arrived too late to save anyone, but just in time to remind the living how fragile certainty has always been. Within law enforcement, quiet audits began. Not formal investigations, not accusations, but reviews driven by discomfort. Old reports were reread with new eyes. Interview notes were examined for tone, for questions not asked, for answers accepted too easily. Supervisors framed it as learning, but everyone understood the undercurrent. This case had slipped through hands that believed they were doing everything right. Veteran detectives spoke openly in internal meetings about the psychology of proximity, about how suspects closest to victims are often subconsciously excluded because acknowledging them would fracture social order. They describe how communities exert pressure, how accusing the familiar can feel like accusing the entire neighborhood. These conversations were not meant for press releases. They were meant to unsettle. Training protocols shifted subtly. New recruits were taught to treat familiarity as a variable, not a safeguard. Case studies emphasize that trust is not evidence, that comfort can be manufactured, that access is often disguised as kindness. The Arizona case was referenced without names, stripped down to patterns and decisions, its emotional weight converted into instruction. Outside official channels, the story took on a different life. Podcasts dissected every phase, voices layered over ambient music, recreating moments that listeners felt they were experiencing in real time. Some presentations were respectful, others sensationalized. The family avoided most of it, learning quickly that public retellings rarely honor private pain. They focused instead on rebuilding routines, grounding themselves in ordinary days that did not revolve around tragedy. Friends who had once shared meals with the convicted individual wrestled with a specific kind of disbelief. They revisited conversations in their minds, searching for cracks that might have been there all along. Some felt anger. Others felt shame. A few felt a chilling sense of recognition, moments that now aligned too perfectly to ignore. None of them spoke easily about it. Psychologists describe this phenomenon as retrospective coherence, the mind's attempt to impose order after chaos. They warned against assuming that clarity after the fact equates to predictability before it. Yet, even with that warning, people continued to look backward, because the alternative was accepting that danger can exist without warning, without pattern, without explanation. The anonymous tip resurfaced in public discourse months later when unrelated cases cited similar breakthroughs. Commentators debated the ethics of anonymity, the balance between accountability and safety. Should tipsters be encouraged with secrecy, or does anonymity undermine trust and outcomes? The Arizona case became a touchstone in that debate, invoked as proof that silence can sometimes serve justice more effectively than transparency. Meanwhile, the physical evidence from the case was archived, labeled, sealed. Boxes that once represented hope and frustration were now artifacts. Their purpose fulfilled, but their presence still heavy. Forensic technicians spoke quietly about the emotional residue of handling remains, about how certain cases follow them long after protocols end. Closure, they said, is a myth professionals tell themselves to keep functioning. The family established a small foundation, not publicized heavily, focused on supporting long-term missing persons cases that had slipped from public attention. They did not position themselves as advocates or activists. They simply understood the cost of being forgotten, of watching resources fade as headlines disappear. Their work was deliberate, understated, driven by memory rather than anger. Community gatherings shifted tone. Memorials that once carried the energy of protest now felt reflective, subdued. Candles burned shorter. Speeches were quieter. The crowd sizes shrank, not from apathy, but from a sense that public mourning had served its purpose and private remembrance needed room. The case had entered a different phase of existence. In the prison system, reports continued to emerge, fragmented and unsatisfying. The convicted individual maintained a low profile, refusing interviews, declining participation in rehabilitation programs that required admission of guilt. Psychiatrists evaluated, documented, and moved on. There was no dramatic unraveling, no cathartic confession. Silence persisted, stubborn and intact. This silence frustrated many. The public wanted explanation, motivation, narrative clarity. They wanted the story to complete itself with understanding. But the absence of confession forced a harsher reality. Some acts are committed without any intention of being understood. Some perpetrators do not seek absolution or recognition. They seek only completion. Years began to stack again, but this time with a different weight. Anniversaries were no longer countdowns to answers, but markers of survival. The family spoke of time as something that no longer felt frozen. It moved now, unevenly, but forward. They learned to hold memory without letting it dictate every breath. The legal system, too, carried forward. Appeals were filed, as expected, grounded in procedural arguments rather than claims of innocence. Courts reviewed transcripts, rulings, evidentiary standards. Each denial reaffirmed the verdict without adding new insight. The machinery of justice turned methodically, indifferent to the emotional stakes that had once surrounded it. Public interest waned, not abruptly, but gradually. The case slipped from front pages to sidebars, then to footnotes. Yet it never fully vanished. It resurfaced whenever discussions turned to cold cases, to anonymous tips, to the danger of assuming the past is settled simply because it is old. In quiet moments, the city remembered the version of itself that existed before the disappearance, before suspicion crept into familiar spaces. That version felt distant now, almost fictional. The case had altered collective memory, dividing time into before and after, even for those who had never met the victim. And so the story continued, not as an investigation, not as a trial, but as an undercurrent, a reminder woven into daily life that certainty is fragile and truth can wait patiently for decades without weakening. The cold case had been cracked, but its echo remained, low and persistent, reminding everyone who listened that answers do not erase impact. They merely redefine it. As the years continued to stretch forward, the case settled into something quieter but no less powerful, a kind of background noise that only became noticeable in moments of stillness. Because the loudest part of a cold case is not the crime or the arrest, but the long aftermath when there is nothing left to do but live with what has been uncovered. Arizona adjusted in ways that were subtle, almost invisible, yet deeply ingrained. The neighborhood where it all began looked unchanged to an outsider. Houses repainted, lawns trimmed, new families moved in with no memory of what had once happened there. But for longtime residents, certain corners still carried weight. A driveway, a streetlight, the absence of a familiar routine. These details did not demand attention, yet they never released it either. The victim's name began appearing in academic papers, not as a person, but as a case reference, a timeline, a data point in discussions about delayed justice. Scholars analyzed the intersection of technology, psychology, and persistence. They debated whether the outcome justified the years of uncertainty. None of them could answer that question definitively, because it was not theirs to answer. Cold case detectives from other states visited Arizona quietly, requesting briefings, not to replicate the story, but to understand the conditions that allowed it to unfold. They asked about the tip, about resource allocation, about decision points where the case might have turned earlier. The answers were honest and unsatisfying. There was no single mistake. There was no single breakthrough. There was only time, and the way it rearranges probability. The family continued their work through the foundation, funding small grants for DNA testing in forgotten cases, offering support to those navigating the endless limbo of not knowing. They avoided public recognition. Their goal was not awareness, but movement. Each case advanced, even slightly, felt like a refusal to let silence win. In media retrospectives, the story was often framed as redemption for the system, proof that justice eventually prevails. The family rejected that framing privately. Justice, they believed, had arrived incomplete, carrying loss that could never be recovered. They did not deny its value, but they refused to let it be portrayed as triumphant. The convicted individual's appeals exhausted themselves over time. Legal language replaced emotional argument, and with each denial, the case hardened into finality. There were no surprises, no reversals. The law settled, even if the heart never would. Psychiatrists continued to study the phenomenon of long-term concealment, using the case as a lens to examine how individuals maintain ordinary lives while carrying extraordinary secrets. Their conclusions were clinical, cautious, emphasizing adaptability rather than monstrosity. This unsettled many readers because it suggested that the capacity for harm is not confined to obvious extremes. The desert, unchanged and indifferent, became a quiet symbol once again. No markers indicated what had been found there. Wind erased footprints as it always had. The land offered no commentary, no moral framing. It simply existed, a reminder that nature does not distinguish between innocence and guilt. Occasionally, someone would claim to have new information, a forgotten witness, a hidden detail. These claims were investigated quickly and efficiently, and then dismissed. The case had reached its evidentiary limit. What remained was not mystery, but interpretation, and interpretation belongs to memory rather than law. Schools and community groups reference the case when discussing safety, trust, and the importance of speaking up. These conversations were careful, avoiding sensationalism, focusing instead on awareness. The story became a tool, stripped of names, reduced to lessons that could be shared without reopening wounds. For the family, grief evolved. It did not diminish, but it changed texture. The sharpness softened into something heavier, more constant. They learned to speak of her in the present tense sometimes, not as denial, but as acknowledgement that influence outlives absence. On the anniversary of the disappearance, they visited the desert quietly, not the site itself, but a place nearby where the horizon opened wide. They stood without ceremony, letting the wind move past them, carrying words they did not need to speak aloud. There were no cameras, no statements, just presence. The city, too, found its own way of remembering, not through monuments or plaques, but through an unspoken awareness that some stories never truly end. The case resurfaced in moments of unrelated loss, in the shared understanding that time can hide harm without erasing it. As new generations grew up, unaware of the fear that once gripped the community, the case lived on as a cautionary echo rather than a lived reality. Its power shifted from immediacy to instruction, from shock to significance. And in that transformation, the cold case took on its final shape. Not a mystery anymore, not a headline, but a quiet reminder woven into the fabric of the place, that truth can arrive late and still matter, that accountability can coexist with unanswered questions, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing when least expected, leaving behind a silence that speaks louder than any revelation ever could. Long after the headlines faded, the case continued to surface in places no one could have predicted, because unresolved trauma does not confine itself to courtrooms or archives. It drifts into culture, into behavior, into the way people make decisions without realizing why. Arizona carried the story forward not as news, but as memory, and memory has a way of reshaping itself with time. In law schools, professors used the case to challenge students on the ethics of delayed prosecution. They asked whether justice loses legitimacy when it arrives decades late, or whether time strengthens its moral authority. The debates were rigorous, abstract, and emotionally distant, yet rooted in a real human absence that could not be fully conveyed through hypotheticals. Former jurors occasionally spoke anonymously, describing the weight of deliberation in a case where history itself felt like evidence. They recalled moments of doubt, the struggle to separate empathy from proof, the realization that their decision would become part of the case's legacy. Serving on that jury, they said, did not end with the verdict. It followed them home. The family marked milestones quietly. Birthdays passed without celebration, acknowledged only through small rituals that made sense only to them. They avoided public statements, not from bitterness, but from exhaustion. Explaining grief repeatedly had become its own burden. Cold case units across the country continued to cite the investigation as an example of patience rewarded, yet internally many detectives framed it differently. They spoke of it as a warning, a reminder that every unsolved case carries the risk of becoming permanent. They pushed for earlier intervention, better follow-up, fewer assumptions. The Arizona case haunted training rooms in ways policy memos never could. The convicted individual's name slowly disappeared from public conversation, replaced by abstract references and anonymized summaries. This anonymity was not mercy. It was inevitability. Attention moves on. What remains is impact, not identity. Occasionally, rumors circulated, claims of jailhouse confessions or secret letters. Each one sparked brief interest before collapsing under scrutiny. No verified admission ever emerged. Silence remained unbroken, denying everyone the satisfaction of narrative closure. Sociologists wrote about the community's response, noting how fear had initially drawn people together and how resolution later allowed them to drift apart again. Shared trauma creates temporary unity. Healing, paradoxically, restores individuality. The case became a footnote in studies about collective behavior, its emotional complexity reduced to data points. The desert, once more, became a metaphor invoked in essays and documentaries. Its vastness symbolized time, concealment, indifference. Yet those who lived near it rejected the symbolism. For them, it was simply land, not a character in the story. The crime had happened there, but it did not belong to the landscape. In private moments, some investigators admitted to lingering unease. They wondered whether the outcome might discourage witnesses in other cases, teaching them that speaking late is acceptable. Others argue the opposite, that the tip proved it is never too late. Both perspectives held truth, and neither offered comfort. The foundation established by the family reached small but meaningful successes. A partial DNA profile matched in a decades-old case. A missing person was identified. These victories were quiet, untelevised, but deeply felt. They did not replace what had been lost, but they transformed pain into motion. The legal precedent set by the case began to appear in appellate decisions, cited in discussions about evidentiary thresholds and the treatment of anonymous information. The story influenced law in ways invisible to the public, embedded in footnotes and citations that carried its echo forward. At community forums, residents sometimes raised the case when discussing safety initiatives, not as a source of fear, but as a reason for vigilance. Trust, they learned, must be balanced with awareness. Familiarity must be paired with accountability. The family spoke once more, years later, at a small event supporting missing persons. Their words were measured, devoid of drama. They spoke about time, about how it can both erode and reveal. They reminded the audience that waiting does not mean forgetting, and that attention, even delayed, can still change outcomes. As technology continued to advance, some speculated whether future tools might uncover details still unknown. But the family expressed little interest in reopening wounds for hypothetical clarity. They had learned that some truths, once established, are enough. The case settled into its final role, not as a mystery or a victory, but as a reference point, a story told when discussing the limits and possibilities of justice. It was no longer about who committed the crime, but about how long it took to acknowledge it. In the quiet spaces between these discussions, the memory of the victim remained intact, not frozen in tragedy, but woven into the lives she had touched. That, perhaps, was the most enduring outcome. Not the arrest, not the verdict, but the persistence of presence and absence. The cold case, once defined by silence, now spoke in subtler ways, through policy, through caution, through remembrance. It no longer demanded attention. It simply existed, a reminder that time can delay truth, but it cannot erase the consequences of its absence. With time, the case stopped being something people talked about and became something they carried, an unspoken reference point that surfaced only when circumstances aligned just right, because stories like this do not demand attention forever. They embed themselves quietly, altering perception rather than conversation. Arizona learned this slowly, through years that felt ordinary on the surface, yet subtly reshaped underneath. The legal finality of the conviction brought a peculiar stillness. No more motions, no more hearings, No more scheduled reminders that the past might resurface again tomorrow. For the justice system, the file was closed. For everyone else, closure remained an abstract concept, discussed more often than experienced. Detectives who had worked the case found themselves measured against it long after retirement. Younger colleagues asked questions not just about evidence, but about instinct, about moments when something felt wrong but could not be articulated. The veterans answered honestly, admitting that intuition without proof is a dangerous thing, yet ignoring intuition entirely can be just as costly. The case became a lesson in balance, taught through regret rather than theory. The family noticed changes in how people approached them. Conversations were gentler now, less burdened by the expectation of hope. Friends no longer asked if there were updates. Instead, they asked how they were sleeping, how they were coping with anniversaries that no longer promised answers. It was a subtle shift, but it mattered. In private, the family spoke about the strange emptiness that followed resolution. For years, their lives had been oriented around waiting, around the possibility that tomorrow might bring news. When tomorrow finally arrived with certainty, it left behind a silence that felt unfamiliar, almost destabilizing. Hope, even painful hope, had structure. Finality did not. Community leaders referenced the case less frequently, not because it had lost importance, but because it had become foundational, something assumed rather than explained. Safety programs were adjusted. Reporting channels emphasized accessibility. These changes were incremental, uncelebrated, yet directly shaped by the knowledge that silence can persist if systems do not invite interruption. The media revisited the story one last time on a major anniversary, framing it as a retrospective. Archival footage played alongside recent interviews. The contrast was stark. Faces aged, voices steadied, grief matured. Viewers were reminded that time had passed, and that passing time had been both enemy and ally. The piece ended with unanswered questions, not as a failure of journalism, but as an acknowledgement of reality. Why had the tip come when it did? What had finally prompted it? Whether anyone else had known and chosen silence. These questions were posed without expectation of response, left hanging deliberately. Online reaction was muted compared to earlier coverage. Fewer comments, less outrage, more reflection. People spoke about patience, about vigilance, about the danger of assuming familiarity equates to safety. The tone suggested that the story had shifted from spectacle to cautionary tale. The prison system continued its routine indifference. Intake assessments gave way to years measured in regulations and schedules. Reports described the convicted individual as compliant, withdrawn, unremarkable. There were no incidents that suggested remorse or defiance, just endurance. Silence remained intact, as if explanation itself had been permanently removed from the equation. Psychologists debated whether silence was denial, control, or simply absence. Their conclusions varied, but all agreed on one point. Understanding motivation would not change outcome. The harm had already been done. Explanation would serve curiosity, not healing. The foundation expanded slowly, deliberately. They avoided growth for its own sake, focusing instead on cases where a small push could make a difference. Families reached out quietly, grateful not for answers, but for recognition. Being seen mattered more than being promised resolution. In one such case, a mother described waiting 25 years without knowing whether to mourn or hope. The family listened without interruption. They did not offer optimism. They offered solidarity. This, they had learned, was more honest. The desert returned to anonymity completely. No reporters, no researchers, just heat, wind, and space. It absorbed memory without commentary, as it always had. The land did not change. People did. Occasionally, someone new to the city would stumble upon the story through an old article or a documentary. They would ask questions, curious, unsettled. Longtime residents answered briefly, without embellishment. The details were no longer shocking. The lesson was what remained. The case influenced how people interpreted other stories. When another missing person was reported, the response was sharper, faster, more insistent. Silence was challenged earlier. Waiting felt less acceptable. This shift was quiet but real, a ripple effect that extended beyond a single narrative. In academic circles, the case was cited again, this time in discussions about societal patience. How long communities are willing to wait for answers. What happens when waiting becomes normalized? The Arizona case stood as evidence that normalization is dangerous. The family, years later, spoke about forgiveness, not as absolution, but as survival. They clarified that forgiving did not mean forgetting or excusing. It meant refusing to let the act define every remaining year. This distinction was often misunderstood, but they did not correct it. Understanding was no longer their responsibility. As the city aged, as neighborhoods changed, the story slipped further into the background, yet it never vanished completely. It surfaced in training manuals, in policy footnotes, in quiet conversations between parents and children about trust and awareness. The cold case had transformed again, this time into something almost invisible, yet deeply influential. It no longer demanded justice. It informed it. It no longer shocked. It warned. In the end, the case did not conclude with a sound, but with a settling, the way dust falls after something heavy has passed through, because stories like this do not finish cleanly. They simply stop moving forward and begin to live quietly inside the people who remain. Arizona carried that stillness now, a silence shaped by knowledge rather than ignorance, heavier in some ways than the waiting that had preceded it. The family learned how to exist beyond the frame of the case. Not beyond the loss, never that, but beyond the constant orientation toward an answer that had once governed every decision. Mornings arrived without expectation. Nights ended without the familiar ache of wondering if tomorrow would finally change everything. This new rhythm felt foreign, even uncomfortable, yet slowly it became survivable. They spoke of memory as something alive, something that changes alongside those who carry it. The image of her no longer froze at the moment of disappearance. It expanded. They allowed themselves to imagine who she might have become, not as fantasy, but as acknowledgement that her story did not end where the crime began. This act of imagination felt like reclaiming ground that time had stolen. The justice system moved on, as it always does. New cases filled calendars. New victims demanded attention. Yet somewhere within its machinery, the Arizona cold case lingered as a reference point, a reminder embedded into procedure that patience without scrutiny is dangerous, and that silence, when left unchallenged, can become an accomplice. Detectives who encountered the case years later described it with a particular tone, not reverent, not triumphant, but cautious. They spoke of it as something earned rather than solved, something that required humility more than brilliance. They warned younger officers against believing that answers arrive on schedule or that truth announces itself clearly. The anonymous tipster remained a shadow to the very end. No unmasking, no recognition, just absence. Some believed that was fitting. Others found it unsettling. A single voice had altered history and then vanished, leaving behind consequences it would never have to witness. The idea disturbed people because it challenged the belief that accountability must always be visible. The city changed in ways unrelated to the case. New buildings rose. Old landmarks disappeared. Streets were renamed. Life asserted itself relentlessly. Yet beneath these changes, there remained a shared understanding that something had happened here that could not be erased by renovation or time. Occasionally, someone would ask whether the case was truly over. The answer depended on who was asked. Legally, yes. Emotionally, no. Culturally, perhaps never. The truth had been acknowledged, but acknowledgement does not dissolve impact. It merely defines it. The foundation continued its quiet work, refusing expansion that might dilute purpose. Each small success felt personal. Each failure felt familiar. They accepted both without ceremony, guided by the knowledge that progress is rarely dramatic and almost never complete. In rare interviews, the family spoke about the danger of romanticizing cold cases. They rejected the idea that time adds intrigue or elegance to tragedy. Time, they said, only adds distance, and distance is cruel. Their words cut through the cinematic framing that often surrounds such stories, grounding them in lived experience. The desert remained unchanged, indifferent as ever. Wind erased tracks, sun bleached stone. Nothing marked the significance of what had been uncovered there, and perhaps that was appropriate. Meaning belonged to people, not land. The earth had simply held what it was given until it was asked to release it. As years layered over the verdict, the case stopped being referenced by date and began being referenced by impact. It was cited not for what happened, but for what followed, for how long truth can hide, for how fragile assumptions are, for how trust, once broken, reshapes everything it touches. The absence of confession remained the final unresolved element, a silence that denied narrative satisfaction. Yet over time, many came to understand that confession would not have changed the core truth. It would not have restored life or erased years of waiting. Silence, in its own way, became an answer. The cold case had been cracked, but what it revealed was not just a perpetrator. It revealed endurance. It revealed the cost of delay. It revealed the quiet strength required to continue without guarantees. And so the story ended where it always had, not in the desert, not in the courtroom, but in the space left behind, the space where a life should have continued and did not. That space remained, unfilled and undeniable, a reminder that justice can name responsibility, but it cannot replace what was taken. The voice fades not because there is nothing left to say, but because what remains cannot be spoken without losing its weight. The case recedes into history, carrying with it a final, unresolved truth that echoes long after the words stop. Some answers arrive too late to change the past, but just in time to ensure it is never forgotten. And beneath all of this, beneath progress and reflection and routine, the absence remained. Not loud, not disruptive, just constant. A reminder that some losses never stop shaping the world around them, even when the story that caused them has finally been told.